415 CE Alexandria. The wheels of a chariot clatter on stone, then lurch to a violent stop. The sound is not of an accident, but of an ambush. Inside sits Hypatia, the most celebrated philosopher in the Roman Empire. Outside, a mob materializes, a black tide of Parabolani monks, their voices roaring a single verdict, which rough hands claw at her, tearing her philosopher's cloak, spitting curses in her face. They haul her from the carriage, and the woman who unraveled the mysteries of the cosmos, is thrown into the filth of the street. Her skin scrapes against sharp stones as they drag her onward, pulling her toward the great church, a place of worship, about to become a slaughterhouse. This was no random riot. It was a targeted assassination, the bloody climax of a Cold War for the soul of the city. Hypatia was not the cause of this war, but she was about to become its most famous casualty. This brutal act wasn't the beginning of the story. It was the horrifying climax. To understand how the jewel of the ancient world, the city of the great library, and rational thought turned on its brightest star, we must unravel the bitter rivalry that set it on fire. How did a war between two powerful men end with a philosopher being torn apart by a mob on the floor of a church? Before we delve into our story, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. It is the sheerest way to join us for every future exploration into the forgotten corners of the past. Inside Hypatia's lecture hall, two students faced each other across an intellectual chasm. One wore the simple tunic of a Christian convert. The other displayed the traditional robes of a pagan philosopher. But here's what made this scene extraordinary. They weren't arguing about gods. They were debating the nature of reality itself. The one cannot be described in human terms, the Christian student insisted, his voice rising with passion. Precisely, Hypatia responded from her teaching platform. That's why we use mathematics to approach the divine, not prayers, not rituals, but pure reason. This was Hypatia's radical experiment. In a city tearing itself apart over religious differences, she had created something impossible. A sanctuary where Christians, pagans, and Jews sat side by side, united by their pursuit of knowledge. She wasn't just teaching philosophy. She was modeling a different way to live. The daughter had surpassed the father. Where Theon had been a competent mathematician, Hypatia had become something more. A celebrity. Intellectual whose fame reached from Alexandria to Athens to Rome. Students traveled for months just to hear her speak. Governors sought her counsel. Even bishops grudgingly acknowledged her brilliance. But step outside her classroom and you entered a different world entirely. Alexandria in 415 wasn't just diverse. It was combustible. Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, and Romans packed into narrow streets where a wrong word could spark a riot. The city had developed its own violent vocabulary. When tensions rose, mobs didn't just gather. They hunted. The sounds of the city told the story. Every few weeks, the normal market chatter would suddenly stop. Then would come the war cries, the crash of overturned stalls, the screams, Christians hunting pagans, pagans hunting Christians, Jews caught in the middle, the authorities barely maintaining control. And this is the key to understanding what would happen to Hypatia. She believed her intellect was armor. She thought reason could stand above the chaos. In her classroom, she had proven it possible. Christians and pagans could discuss the nature of the infinite without reaching for knives. Knowledge could transcend tribe. She taught astronomy using an astrolabe of her own design. She explained the movements of the planets without invoking Apollo's chariot or Christ's Providence, just mathematics and observation. Her students learned to question everything, to follow logic. Wherever it led, to never accept an answer simply because tradition demanded it. Here's where the story takes a turn. This very brilliance, this commitment to pure reason made her dangerous to everyone. To the Christians, she was a pagan who refused to convert despite understanding their theology better than most bishops. To the pagans, she was a traitor who stripped their mysteries of supernatural power. She stood alone, protected only by her reputation and the thin walls of her school. The city's new Christian leadership watched her with growing unease. Every student who entered her school learned to think beyond religious categories. Every aristocrat who sought her advice learned to value logic over faith. She wasn't actively opposing Christianity. That would have been too simple. She was doing something far more threatening. She was making it irrelevant. Picture the scene from the street. Her school glowed with lamplight late into the night while students debated and calculated. The sounds of intellectual discovery drifted out, excited voices. The scratch of styluses on wax tablets. Occasional laughter when someone made a particularly clever point. It was an island of enlightenment in an ocean of growing darkness. But islands can be overwhelmed by rising tides. And in Alexandria, a new tide was rising, one that had no patience for debate, no tolerance for questions, no respect for knowledge that didn't serve its purpose. This tide wore the black robes of monks, and it was led by a man who understood that in a city of riots, the one who controlled the mob controlled everything. Hypatia was a symbol of reason, protected by the walls of her school and the power of her intellect. But out on the streets, a new kind of power was gathering, one that had no respect for reason and saw her sanctuary as a target. The word monk brings to mind peace and prayer. But in Cyril's Alexandria, monk meant something else entirely. It meant soldier. They came from the desert monasteries in groups of 50, 100, sometimes more. The Parabolani, they called themselves, those who risk their lives. Officially, they were nurses who tended the sick during plagues. But everyone knew what they really were. Bishop Cyril's private army. Watch them march through the Rhodes district. Black robes, billowing, wooden clubs barely concealed, faces set with divine purpose. They moved like a military unit. Because that's exactly what they were. When they reached the small shrine to Isis, they didn't hesitate. The crash of splintering wood echoed through the neighborhood. Ancient statues toppled and shattered. Sacred texts became fuel for bonfires. The locals cowered in doorways, too terrified to intervene. These weren't vandals or common thugs. These were men who believed they were doing God's work, and their leader, Bishop Cyril, had given them a sacred mission. Purify Alexandria. Now you have to understand Cyril to understand what happened to Hypatia. His uncle Theophilus had been bishop before him. A man who understood the art of religious warfare. But where Theophilus used politics, Cyril preferred force. He didn't just want to lead Alexandria's Christians. He wanted to command the entire city. The transformation was systematic. First came the Jewish quarter. Cyril declared their synagogues were really fortresses, harboring weapons. The Parabolani struck at dawn, driving thousands of Jews from homes their families had occupied for centuries. The governor protested. But what could he do against holy warriors who claimed divine authority? Here's what made Cyril genius and terrible in equal measure. He understood symbols. When his monks destroyed a pagan temple, they didn't just tear it down. They built a church on the ruins. When they expelled the Jews, they didn't just take their property. They transformed synagogues into monasteries. Every act of violence became a monument to Christian triumph. The monks sang as they worked. Hymns of praise mixed with the crash of demolition. To them, every shattered idol was a victory for Christ. Every fleeing pagan proved God's power. They weren't destroying. They were cleansing. They weren't attacking. They were defending the faith, and this is crucial. They were absolutely sincere. The Parabolani weren't cynical opportunists. They were true believers who saw Alexandria as a spiritual battlefield. Every non-Christian was either an enemy to defeat or a soul to save. There was no middle ground, no room for the kind of philosophical neutrality Hypatia represented. The city's pagan population watched their world disappear piece by piece. The Serapeum, the great temple library that had stood for 7 centuries, fell to Cyril's predecessor. The Caesareum, where Cleopatra once worshipped, became a church. Sacred groves were cut down. Holy springs were filled with rubble. 1,000 years of tradition erased in a few violent years. But temples were just buildings. Cyril knew the real enemy was more subtle. The real enemy was the idea that Christianity was just one truth among many. The real enemy was the suggestion that wisdom could exist outside Scripture. The real enemy was anyone who taught people to think for themselves rather than simply believe. The Parabolani patrolled the streets like an occupying army. They monitored lecture halls and bathhouse, markets and theaters. They took notes on who associated with known pagans who missed church services, who asked too many questions. They created an atmosphere where even private doubt became dangerous. Cyril preached every Sunday to packed churches. His sermons were masterpieces of controlled fury. He painted word pictures of Alexandria's glorious Christian future, but only if the faithful had courage to seize it. He named no names, but everyone understood. The pagans, the philosophers, the ones who poisoned young minds with their questions. The monks absorbed every word. They saw themselves as holy warriors in a cosmic battle. Every blow they struck against paganism brought the kingdom of heaven closer. Every heretic they silenced saved countless souls from damnation. Violence wasn't just permitted. It was sacred duty. The smart pagans saw the writing on the wall. They converted, fled, or fell silent. But Hypatia did none of these things. She continued teaching, continued questioning, continued living as if reason still mattered more than force. Cyril's army was on the march, cleansing the city of its pagan past. Soon they would turn their attention to the pagans of the present. And the most famous pagan in all of Alexandria was Hypatia. As Cyril's forces laid siege to the great pagan temple of the Capium, Hypatia watched from a distance, but she didn't send help. The smoke rose in black columns above Alexandria's skyline. Inside the temple complex, the last pagan priests made their final stand. They barricaded doors that had welcomed worshippers for centuries. They gathered their sacred texts, knowing they would burn either way, by Christian hands or their own. Outside, the Parabolani waited with the patience of hunters. Hypatia received desperate messages. The philosophers must stand together. One priest wrote, "Your influence could save us." She read the letter, set it aside, and returned to her calculations. When pressed by her students, her response was cutting. They defend statues and superstitions. I defend truth. This was Hypatia's fatal flaw. She wasn't just a pagan in Christian eyes. She was barely a pagan in pagan eyes. Her Neoplatonism had evolved far beyond the ritual observances and mythological narratives that sustained traditional paganism. 2. Her, the gods were metaphors useful for the simple-minded but unnecessary for true philosophers. She had made her position clear years earlier. When pagan priests performed their divinations, casting lots and reading entrails, Hypatia called it theatrical nonsense. When they claimed direct communication with the gods through dreams and visions, she dismissed it as wish fulfillment dressed in mystery. The divine, she taught, could only be approached through mathematics and logic, not through blood sacrifice and incense. The traditional pagans had long memories. They remembered her mockery. They recalled her students laughing at their ancient rites. They knew she considered their temple ceremonies as primitive as Christian miracle worship. So when the crisis came, when they needed allies most desperately, Hypatia's name was notably absent from their councils of war. But here's what she failed to understand. In a city dividing into armed camps, neutrality was impossible. By refusing to defend the temples, she didn't appear principled. She appeared weak. By criticizing both sides' superstitions, she didn't seem wise. She seemed arrogant. The Serapeum fell after a 3-day siege. The Parabolani dragged out the massive statue of Capys, the god who had protected Alexandria for 700 years. They hacked it apart with axes, while pagan citizens wept. The temple's legendary library, what remained after earlier purges, went up in flames. Philosophical treatises and mathematical texts burned alongside religious scrolls. Hypatia's students brought her eyewitness accounts. The monks had been methodical, they reported. They destroyed the obviously pagan materials. First statues, altars, ritual objects. But then they kept going. Mathematical texts that mentioned Greek gods. Astronomical works that described celestial bodies as divine. Even philosophical dialogues that questioned too deeply. They're erasing everything, one student said, his voice shaking. Not just the religion, the entire intellectual tradition. Hypatia remained unmoved. Truth cannot be erased, she replied. It can only be rediscovered. Let them burn their books. Mathematics exists independent of any text. This response revealed the depth of her isolation. She believed pure reason transcended cultural context. She thought her philosophy floated above the bloody struggles of the street. But ideas need people to think them, and people need safety to think freely. By abandoning the pagan institutions, she was soaring off the branch she sat on. The moderate pagans who might have been her allies grew bitter. She had refused to help save their temples. Why should they risk themselves for her school? The Christian authorities noted her indifference to the siege. If she wouldn't defend paganism, perhaps she could be turned. Bishop Cyril himself was said to have remarked, "The philosopher shows wisdom in abandoning false gods. Perhaps she will complete her journey to truth." But Hypatia had no interest in anyone's truth but her own. She continued her lectures on the nature of the One, the divine principle that transcended all human categories. She taught her students to rise above religious identity through intellectual discipline. She believed the mind properly trained could stand outside history, culture, even politics. The irony was razor sharp. In trying to stand above the conflict, she had positioned herself perfectly in the crosshairs. The Christians saw her as a pagan who corrupted youth with godless philosophy. The pagans saw her as a traitor who let their world burn while she played with numbers. She stood alone, believing her intellect was all the protection she needed. She was an island, and the tide of fanaticism was rising all around her. The war for Alexandria began with a single man screaming in a public theater. Governor Arrest sat in the place of honor. Surrounded by his officials, reading aloud the new imperial edicts about public entertainment. The crowd listened with typical Alexandrian restlessness until a voice cut through the formal proclamations. Blasphemy. The governor permits Satan's entertainments. Every head turned. There in the middle of the crowd stood Hypatia, one of Cyril's most devoted followers. Not a monk, but something perhaps more dangerous. A fanatic with social standing. He had chosen his moment perfectly. Maximum publicity, maximum humiliation for the imperial representative. Arrests felt the familiar rage rise in his chest. 4 months, Cyril had been testing him. The illegal expulsion of the Jews, the destruction of temples without authorization, the Parabolani patrolling streets they had no right to control. And now this, a direct challenge to imperial authority in the most public venue possible. The governor's guards moved through the crowd with practiced efficiency. They seized Hypatia before he could speak another word. But the damage was done. The confrontation everyone had been expecting was finally here. Church versus state, bishop versus governor. The only question was who would blink first. Here's what you need to understand about Arrests. He was a Christian himself, baptized in Constantinople before taking office. But he was a Christian of the old school. Religion was personal, government was secular, and bishops should stick to saving souls. Cyril's vision of theocratic rule horrified him as much as any pagan philosopher. The governor made his choice. Hypatia would be flogged publicly in the same theater where he had shown such disrespect. Not just flogged, tortured. The message had to be crystal clear. Challenge imperial authority. Suffer imperial justice. The next morning, Alexandria woke to screams echoing from the theater. Arrests had his best torturers handle the matter. They were professionals who knew how to make pain last, how to make it public, how to make it unforgettable. Hieras. Cries carried across the central district. By noon, half the city had heard them. But Arrests had miscalculated. He thought he was punishing a disruptive fanatic. Cyril saw an opportunity to create a martyr. Within hours, the bishop's version spread through Christian neighborhoods. A faithful believer tortured for speaking God's truth. The governor had revealed himself as a persecutor, an enemy of the church, possibly an apostate. The battle lines were drawn with Hypaxia's blood. Cyril mobilized his monks, but cleverly no direct assault on the governor's palace. That would be treason. Instead, they began a campaign of intimidation. Wherever Arrests went, crowds of Parabolani followed, silent at first, then murmuring prayers, then shouting condemnations. Picture the scene. The governor's chariot trying to conduct normal business while surrounded by hundreds of black-robed monks. They didn't attack, but they pressed close. They didn't explicitly threaten, but their presence was threat enough. Every official who met with Arrests had to push through this gauntlet of religious fury. The psychological warfare was brilliant. Arrests couldn't arrest them. They were just praying citizens. He couldn't disperse them. They claimed religious freedom. But he also couldn't govern with a hostile mob tracking his every movement. The normal functioning of imperial administration ground to a halt. Now, here's where Hypatia enters the picture. She and Arrests had been intellectual companions for years. The governor, despite his Christianity, appreciated her philosophical approach. He often sought her counsel on matters of governance, finding her logical mind a refreshing contrast to the heated passions of religious politics. Their public friendship became a weapon in Cyril's hands. See how the governor consorts with pagans. See how he prefers the company of that woman to faithful Christians. The whispers started immediately. Some went further. Was their relationship merely intellectual? In a city where sexual slander was political currency, the implications were dangerous. Orestes faced an impossible choice. Distance himself from Hypatia and appear weak, confirming Cyril's power to dictate his associations or maintain the friendship. And give the bishop ammunition for further attacks. He chose defiance, visiting her school publicly, making sure the city saw that the governor would not be intimidated. The tension reached breaking point. The city held its breath, waiting for the next escalation. Both sides were gathering forces, preparing for a confrontation that seemed inevitable. Orestes had drawn his line in the sand, using a man's body as the ink. He had publicly challenged the bishop. Now the entire city held its breath, waiting to see how Cyril would retaliate. The answer would be a masterclass in political savagery. A monk named Ammonius threw a stone. It was a pathetic act of defiance, but it was the excuse both sides were looking for. The governor's chariot moved through the streets under heavy guard. The Parabolani followed their usual pattern, surrounding, chanting, intimidating. But today, something was different. The monks pressed closer. Their prayers grew louder, more aggressive. Then came the moment that changed everything. The stone flew from the crowd with perfect accuracy. It struck Orestes on the head, opening a gash that sent blood streaming down his face. For a heartbeat, the entire street froze. The governor of Alexandria, representative of the emperor, bleeding from a monk's assault. The guards exploded into action. They plunged into the mass of black robes, searching for the attacker. Most of the Parabolani scattered, but Ammonius stood his ground. He didn't run. He didn't deny his act. He raised his arms in triumph, shouting, "Strike down the enemy of Christ." They dragged him before Orestes, who sat in his chariot, blood still running into his eyes. The governor's physicians wanted to tend the wound, but Orestes waved them away. He wanted the city to see him like this, bleeding, attacked, but unbroken. He passed judgment right there in the street. "This man has assaulted the emperor's representative," Orestes declared, his voice carrying over the crowd. "The penalty is death, but first he will confess his conspirators under questioning." Everyone understood what questioning meant. Ammonius would be tortured until he named names, hopefully leading back to Cyril himself. The monk was hauled away to the prefecture's dungeons, where professional interrogators waited with their implements. The torture lasted 2 days. The screams echoed from the palace as they had once echoed from the theater, but Ammonius gave them nothing. No conspirators, no papal orders, just prayers and curses in equal measure. On the second night, his body finally gave out. He died under the torturer's hands, taking any secrets to his grave. And this is where Cyril proved his genius for propaganda. Within hours of Ammonius's death, the bishop's agents had retrieved the body. Not secretly, they made a public procession of it. They washed the corpse, dressed it in white robes, and carried it through the Christian districts like a fallen hero. But Cyril wasn't finished. He renamed the dead monk. Ammonius became Thracius, the admirable one. The thug who threw stones became a holy warrior who stood against tyranny. The criminal became a saint, complete with feast day and sacred relics. The Sunday sermon was Cyril's masterpiece. He stood before thousands of Christians. The wrapped body of Saint Thomasius displayed before the altar. His voice rang through the basilica as he were a narrative of martyrdom. A humble monk moved by divine inspiration had stood against a governor who tortured the faithful. He had paid with his life joining the glorious company of martyrs. "See how they fear us," Cyril proclaimed. "See how they resort to torture and murder." The governor shows his true nature. Not a Christian but a persecutor of Christians. He spills holy blood as his pagan friends demand. That phrase pagan friends was carefully chosen. Everyone knew who Arrest's most famous pagan friend was. Without naming Hypatia, Cyril had painted a target on her back. She was the shadow behind the throne, the whisper in the governor's ear. The reason good Christians suffered. The cult of Saint Thasius spread like wildfire. Christians wore scraps of cloth touched to his body as protective amulets. They told stories of miracles at his temporary tomb. The Parabolani had a new rallying cry. Remember Thomasius. What had been a political conflict now had the fever heat of religious war. Arrests watched in horror as Cyril transformed his act of justice into proof of persecution. He tried to counter with facts. Ammonius was a criminal who assaulted an imperial officer. But facts were weak weapons against martyrdom. The bishop had turned a dead thug into a saint, and saints are more powerful than any living governor. The moderate Christians found themselves trapped, reject Saint Thomasius, and appear to side with the persecutor. Arrests, accept him, and validate Cyril's increasingly radical stance. Most chose silence, which Cyril interpreted as consent. The game had changed. Bodies were now political pawns. Fanaticism was now sainthood. And a rumor was beginning to spread through the city. A lie that would connect the governor's defiance to the city's pagan philosopher. A lie that would be Hypatia's death warrant. A young student's earnest voice. "Hypatia, I love you." Then Hypatia's cold clinical response. The mathematics lesson had ended. Other students filed out of the lecture hall, but one remained behind. He was young, aristocratic, with the kind of classical features that would have made him a catch for any senatorial family. But he had eyes only for his teacher, and in those eyes burned something far removed from philosophical inquiry. "I must speak freely," he said, his carefully prepared speech tumbling out. "Your wisdom has captured more than my mind. I think of you constantly. I would make you my wife, give you status, protection." Hypatia listened with the same expression she wore while correcting mathematical proofs. When he finished, she said simply, "Wait here." She left the room. The young man's heart raced. Perhaps she was considering his offer. Perhaps she needed time to compose herself. Perhaps she returned, carrying something wrapped in cloth. Without ceremony, she placed it in his hands. The fabric was warm, stained. The smell hit him immediately. He recoiled, dropping the bundle. A menstrual rag fell to the floor between them. "This is what you claim to love," Hypatia said, her voice devoid of emotion. "This is the physical reality beneath your romantic delusions. The body is corruption. The flesh is decay. True love exists only in the realm of pure thought, in the contemplation of eternal forms. What you feel is not love. It is biological impulse dressed in pretty words." The student stared at her, then at the soiled cloth, his adoration curdled into something else. Shame, rage, disgust. He fled the room without another word. But he would speak many words later to many people, and with each telling, the story would grow. Worse. Here's what Hypatia thought she was doing, delivering a philosophical lesson in the Platonic tradition. The body was a prison for the soul. Physical desire was a chain that kept humans from ascending to true knowledge by showing him the messy reality of female biology. She was freeing him from illusion. But here's what actually happened. She had humiliated a wealthy young man in the most visceral way possible. In a culture where female purity was currency and menstruation was considered unclean, she had committed an act of breathtaking transgression. The story spread through Alexandria's elite like plague. Each retelling added new details. She had thrown it at him. She had laughed while doing it. She had mocked his manhood. She had boasted that no man could touch her. The menstrual rag became a symbol of her contempt not just for one student, but for all normal human feeling. The pagan intellectuals tried to defend her. You don't understand. They said it was a philosophical demonstration. In the symposium, Plato writes, but nobody wanted to hear about Plato. They wanted to hear about the woman who thought she was too good for mortal love. The Christians seized on the story with glee. Here was proof of pagan degeneracy. What kind of woman behaves this way? Not a proper woman at all, but a creature corrupted by too much learning, too much pride. She had forgotten her place, and this grotesque act proved it. Even her supporters found the incident troubling. Yes, they understood the philosophical point, but did she have to make it so dramatically? Couldn't she have simply explained the doctrine of physical transcendence without the visual aid? Her brilliance had always been paired with a certain coldness, but this seemed to cross into cruelty. The rejected student became a fixture in certain circles, telling and retelling his humiliation. Each time, Hypatia became less human, more monster. She was the woman who despised love itself. She was the teacher who destroyed souls instead of nurturing them. She was the pagan who reveled in pollution. The Parabolani absorbed these stories into their growing mythology of Hypatia. Not just a pagan philosopher, but an active corrupter. Not just wrong, but wickedly wrong. The kind of person who would take innocent Christian love and transform it into something dirty and shameful. Meanwhile, Hypatia continued teaching as if nothing had happened. She had made her point. The student had learned his lesson. The matter was settled. She had no idea that her lesson was being transformed into evidence of her inhuman nature. In her world, it was a profound philosophical statement. But in the streets, the rumor was simpler. The pagan which Hypatia despises all normal human feeling. And that rumor reached the ears of the very monks who were looking for a new enemy. The whisper started in the markets. Why won't the governor make peace with the bishop? One monk would ask. Another would answer, he can't. He's under the spell of the witch, Hypatia. The lie was elegant in its simplicity. Arrests and Cyril had been locked in their power struggle for months. The city bled from their conflict, riots, murders, fear in every neighborhood. Good Christians prayed for reconciliation, but peace never came. Why? The answer spread from mouth to mouth, stall to stall, church to church. Hypatia had bewitched the governor. She used her feminine her pagan magic, her demonic mathematics to cloud his judgment. Without her influence, arrests would naturally submit to the righteous authority of the bishop. She alone stood between Alexandria and harmony. The story grew. With each telling, someone had seen her preparing potions in her study, actually astronomical calculations. But who could tell the difference? Others swore she met with the governor at night for unspeakable rituals. In reality, discussions of tax policy and grain distribution. Her mathematical instruments became tools of divination. Her philosophical dialogues became incantations. Here's the terrible brilliance of the lie. It explained everything while requiring no proof. Why did arrests resist Cyril? Hypatia's spell. Why did he maintain pagan friendships? Hypatia's influence. Why did he torture good Christians like Thalassius? Hypatia's whispered advice. She became the shadow explanation for every conflict. The Parabolani spread the narrative with disciplined precision. They didn't shout it from street corners. That would seem crude. Instead, they planted seeds of doubt in casual conversation. Such a shame about the governor. Yes, if only he could think clearly. They say she has strange powers. Well, you know what philosophers study in secret. Cyril himself maintained plausible deniability. His sermons never mentioned Hypatia by name. But he preached about Jezebel, who corrupted kings. He warned against false prophets who use knowledge to lead the faithful astray. He reminded his flock that Satan often appeared as an angel of light or a beautiful teacher. The respectable Christians initially resisted the slander. Many had attended Hypatia's lectures. They knew her as a woman of fierce intellect but impeccable virtue. The idea of her as some kind of sorceress was absurd. But even they had to admit, why else would arrests remain so stubborn? Then came the master stroke. A letter supposedly from arrests to Hypatia surfaced in the Agora, almost certainly a forgery, but perfectly crafted. It spoke of seeking her counsel in all matters, and trusting her above all others, nothing explicitly improper, but in the fevered atmosphere of the city, it read like a confession of enslavement. The moderate voices grew quiet. If even the governor admitted she was his primary adviser, if he valued a pagan woman's opinion over Christian bishops, perhaps there was something to the rumors after all. The benefit of the doubt, already strained, finally snapped. Peter the Reader, Cyril's right hand, began holding special prayer meetings, ostensibly to pray for the governor's liberation from evil influences. In practice, to whip the faithful into ever greater fury against the specific evil influence everyone now had in mind. The prayers grew more militant. The identification of the enemy grew more explicit. Lord, break the chains that bind our leaders. Free them from the whispers of the ungodly. Cast down those who stand between your church and victory. By early March 415, the atmosphere was volcanic. Every Christian in Alexandria knew that Hypatia was the sole obstacle to peace. Remove her and arrests would